The first thing I wanted to ask you was, after all your years of writing nonfiction as an academic, whether writing a novel was like being let out to play and to do what you wanted suddenly.
Well, absolutely. If I look at my academic career, such as it was, it consisted of dozens and dozens of academic articles, about five academic books of, sizable ones, and endless footnotes in all of that. And every fact which was written down had to be what we would call today fact checked. And also, academic language is very limited, and in my field, which was strategic studies, quite pompous. So I really needed to break out of that situation from time to time, attempted to write, found I didn't have the time to do so. And so when this came along and I started to write, I thought I was in heaven. In a sense, I had to give myself permission to do what I wanted to do. And the approach I took was one of extreme irresponsibility. I thought I'll just sit down and write. It's only for myself, and I'll see what comes out the other end, and it probably won't matter. So that's the sort of process I used, and it was great.
Yes, it must have been liberating. And as you say, giving yourself license is quite hard when you've been disciplined in that way, giving yourself license to play. But you also have a clear long-term interest in the way societies function and change. And it seemed to me that that could have been stymied or controlled by your academic background. But in that process, you took on the task of creating a sense of that social change through the characters you wrote about. And that's quite an act of imagination. I think you achieved that wonderfully. So do you have any comment about that challenge of turning your interest in society into a flesh and blood interest in people?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And first of all, about the point of social change, we're all of a certain age. We've all lived through enormous changes. There was the war and the effect it had on our parents and the effect that that consequently had on ourselves. Then the 60s came along with changes, the sexual revolution, a sense of rebellion, Vietnam, and above all, freedom, a sense of freedom from the responsibilities that seemed to have dragged down our parents' generation. And this was both exciting and profoundly unsettling. And also in my own life, I've experienced directly the decline of what one might call the old squattocracy. And that was a direct experience. So I certainly wanted to chronicle these changes. And as you say, I think it's difficult to do it in the form of a novel. And I wanted to do it from, in particular, two perspectives. On the one hand, we have the character Nick, who really wants to experience the world through a search for meaning and a search for creativity and art, rather than simply adopting the given role, his given role as heir to Owl Creek, this great big rural property. And this particular quest to experience the world through a quest for meaning and art, it happened to collide with the 60s in a really unfortunate way. It left him profoundly centerless and unsettled, and indeed cut adrift and floundering. Richard, on the other hand, the son of a stockman, was driven by a different sort of a need to rise above his background, to assert himself, to be successful, and in a sense, underlying all of this, to gather power. And this seemingly left him better able to cope with the 60s. He had a much stronger sense of direction. But it also involved a profound betrayal, a betrayal of his father's old, decent Catholic working class roots for a much more right-wing orientation. And along the way to power, a betrayal of other people who'd helped him and with whom he had personal relationships. So while he was on the surface better able to ride out this time, he too was left in some ways just as dislocated.
That's fascinating, Sandy.
Yep.
Really interesting, because in a way, if you're just thinking about these two main characters, that many of the people who will be listening to this, many of your friends and family who are listening to this recording won't yet know those characters well. But in a way, I think the way you've described it just then, Nick, in a sense, betrayed his family's expectations, and in a passive way, in a removing himself way, whereas Richard betrayed his family's background in an active, taking on the world way. And it's quite interesting. I just setting it up in that way is quite an interesting, gives an interesting sense of the dynamics in the book, I think.
Well, I think, and this sense of betrayal is the sort of flip side of that is loyalty. And loyalty and honor are important. We can talk about them a bit later, but particularly loyalty, I think, through mateship and the idea of being a good bloke. Richard keeps returning to this theme of what it is to be a good bloke, and he doesn't quite understand it. But in the end, he concludes it's something to do with being loyal to your mates. You don't have to be good at sport. He was, but you don't have to be. Just got to be loyal to your mates. So, yeah, I think that sense of loyalty is important in leaving. Yeah.
Yes, and yes, the tension between the characters is intrinsic to the tension, other tensions throughout the book that we'll come to later. But the next obvious question I wanted to ask you is that every author of the first novel gets asked how autobiographical their book is. And I understand that as a novelist myself, but I also understand that the process of creating an imaginary world has demands that insist that you reform those immediate memories and experience into something that is true to the novel. And I wondered if you had something to comment about that.
Well, I think it's very autobiographical in the general sense of the changes about which I've just been speaking. My lifespan reflects almost exactly the lifespan of the main protagonists of the book. So in that general sense, it is very autobiographical. That said, the characters are not entirely the characters of my own life by any means. But let me just take the example of Nick. He's in fact a composite of various people I've known, and I think you'd know this as a writer, that characters are composite characters, but particularly composite character of someone with whom I was at primary boarding school, who was a fantastic raconteur and storyteller, who used to keep us up after the lights out every night, and he was utterly brilliant. And I can't really say his name, and then at university he burnt out with a brilliant flash of light, and went on much the same trajectory as Nick. In other words, it was a promise which was unrealized. And also, as part of my earlier writing, I'd tried to write a book on the French poet Arthur Rimbaud, and hadn't really succeeded in that because I didn't have time or energy. But Nick, in some ways, his life does parallel that Rimbaud, in that he had this earlier phase of creativity, then he left, and his life became what he saw. His life became travel and vision, what Rimbaud called the great world. Again, there are elements in Nick which I can see and recognize. His dislike of shooting and killing things. Same with me, although in my case it was mainly because I was a poor shot. But there are others as well. His shame about his social status. I felt that as a young kid as well. What is true to my own background is the hardness, the toughness of that, the leanness of that environment. In a sense, it's summarized by David Campbell's image of the snow gum's skeleton being exposed by the harsh winds of the region. So all of that's true. There are also elements of other houses I've known. People who know me in my childhood will know that attic very well, which is mentioned in the beginning of the book. Equally, Richard's tendency to think of himself as a man of affairs, a kind of Thomas Cromwell type figure, uh, someone who's willing to compromise, as he puts it, to break eggs in order to make an omelette. That comes out of my own experience as a public servant. Not that I'd achieved any power myself, but I'd seen people who had, and I'd sort of talk to them about their rationale for what they had to do, the slippery, slimy things they sometimes had to do. And incidentally, that Cromwellian self-justification around compromise versus a man of affairs who achieves things is absolutely anathema to Nick. It's another point of difference. For Nick, compromise is death. For Nick, he wants to work at the very outer reaches of what is safe in order to create and to find out about truth.
All that makes absolute sense, because the imaginative act of transforming reality into fiction is an alchemy that's actually absolutely essential to the process. But nonetheless, elements of reality constantly seep into all good writing. And I think there are clear elements of the landscape you grew up in and knew well and saw all the time and felt and had just seeping into your being are there throughout that part of the book. And obviously your experience of Sydney and your experience of the Indian subcontinent. I mean, some of the most vital writing in the book is of the Indian subcontinent. It has a wonderful sense of reality and richness, almost in passing, but of course it's at the service of your story. It's not there for its own sake. It's at the service of your story, and that's what makes it vital, perhaps, I think.
Well, yeah, I think all of those points are very good points. I should have also added, I think, that growing up on the land gives one a sense of the people who work there, their language, their mannerisms, and so on, which I found absolutely invaluable, particularly in those early stages of the book. Indeed, one couldn't, I believe, have written the book without that experience of those people. And they're very alive to me, even today.
Yes, I think, Sandy, one of the things that is the strength of the book, that they were also alive to you in your discomfort in the contrast between the social station of the people involved, because you have a feeling for all the people's position in the book, which I think is probably a reflection of your empathy for people generally, and your discomfort as a child. As you say, you were embarrassed or ashamed of your social station. I think that's actually been an advantage to you in writing the book.
Well, certainly Nick is put into that framework, although he's a much more, in a way, courageous person than I ever was. He's able to live his beliefs a little bit more, but that also leads him into a terribly dark place. So that's the other side of it.
Yes, because he was trying to find where to go with those doubts and passions and questions, wasn't he? And one of the interesting things about the book is, and we don't want to give too much away, but his voyage towards trying to find that path is something the book follows very astutely, I think, and with feeling. Yeah. So, Sandy, I have to ask you about that word honor that we've discussed quite a lot through our discussions, a rather old-fashioned word, honor and duty, and the role it had in both Nick and Richard and the rest of the characters, Nick's sister, of course, Lily, various characters in the book, and as well as their parents, the role of honor and duty in their lives, and the role of honor and duty in the life of Mujahid, who Nick encounters and we meet throughout the book, and how they seem to come from very different backgrounds, but in the end, there's something they share. Nick's past, of a privileged past that he turns his back on as a white Australian, and the Mujahid's rather idealized view of his childhood village, and how in the end there's something they share in common, perhaps.
Yeah, it's an excellent question and a slippery one, and I'll try my best to do it justice. At one level, I think you're absolutely right. Nick's and the Mujahid's birth sense of honour, let me put it that way, are very, very similar. And that goes back to the history of the old squattocracy, if I could refer to them in that way. To them, loyalty, bravery, and honesty were everything, and particularly bravery and one's war records and an absolute bravery in the war and commitment in the war were very similar to the sort of tribal loyalties about bravery and honour with which the Mujahid, who was a Pashtun, grew up. And the Pashtun have an acute sense of tribal honour, which is built around those very same issues of loyalty to one's tribe, bravery, and determination to defend one's birthright. So, in that birth sense, they're very, very similar. And I think, as you say, that in a sense helps them to understand each other through a very difficult time. And in another sense, cowardice, as far as Nick's family is concerned, is almost the worst of crimes. In fact, Nick was disinherited because he won't go to Vietnam, which was considered by his father to be an act of cowardice. And however, in a sort of subtle twist to this, Nick moves on from that sense of honour, which he believes leads to a path of destruction and death. And I'll just quote here from his diary: duty, honour, loyalty, death. These four ride side by side over the blistered landscape and will do so for as long as we humans occupy the planet. So from this sort of belief about the failings of this traditional sense of honour, he derives a somewhat different sense of honour where he comes to think of it as internally driven and that you have to be true to yourself to be honourable. He's still very interested in honour, but it's a different sort of honour. And there's an irony here because in dying, his father expresses very much a similar sort of view. He says, I don't know what God wants of me, or even if there is a God, but I know that I want to die to be considered a man of honour and that that's important to me. So it's this sort of amorphous sense of honour almost that they've both returned to. And I think there's a double irony here, because if honour is not derived from loyalty to some externally derived sense of law or tribe or religion, then from where does it come? For Nick, he eventually comes up with, I think, a rather somewhat weak sense of humanism and some relation to free choice, that we have to choose the right path, and it's in the ability to choose that we're seen as individuals and human beings. But it's never quite satisfactory, and it's quixotic. In a sense, he returns to a more original quixotic sense of honour, in that he's seeking an honour that probably doesn't exist, or if it does, we may never know what it is. In other words, he says, we won't know what the truth is, but the seeking of that truth has still been important to me. So it's I say, it's quixotic, but it also is strangely honourable that he pursues this path, as I say, into some dark places without giving too much more away.
Yes, I mean, obviously, Nick does damage in his life to various people, but I think the feeling that I had in terms of his coming to terms with his life, his taking responsibility in some way and trying to be honest with himself, is part of his honorable path in the end. I don't know if that was something you intended.
That's absolutely right. And also, and this is he recognizes this as a weird sort of twist, that if he is to die, he wants to do it properly in that old-fashioned sense of being brave and having a good death. And he realizes totally the irony of this.
Yes.
He thinks he's moved away from that.
But in the end, he's doing what his father would have done.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And
Yes.
also, ironically, the Mujahid respects him in that moment too.
Yes. Again, without giving too much away. Yes.
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
he respects him. Um, he respects him both in that sense, in the sense of his sense of honor as being a good person, but also he respects him as an intellect as well. And one of the things they really share is that intellectual discourse, although it can only go so far because they have a set of deep differences around religion and what it is to be a human being.
Yes, I think in the end, the Mujahid, even though he feels a commonality with Nick, doesn't respect the framework of his beliefs and views.
No, and he doesn't respect the West, and he doesn't respect particularly the wishy-washiness of the casuistry of the West. Uh, he says with some contempt, Nick says, well, if I was anything, I'd be a sort of Buddhist. And the Mujahidi says contemptuously, sort of, sort of. You Westerners don't even know what you are.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
indeed. But I think in the end, this is one of the great virtues of the book. I mean, obviously, it's a classic tale of Australian life through the second half of the 20th century that you pulled off with great elan. But I think the other thing it does is that it shows because of the contrast between Nick's experience and his coming to sort of a certain sorts of coming to brook with the Mujahid and their discussions, even though he feels the Mujahid can't understand him fully. That interaction throws into perspective the world that Nick comes from. And I think that's one of the achievements of the book, that the contrast, the almost glancing contrast between Australian Western life and the life of the Mujahid creates a wonderful perspective on our own world and how we operate within it.
Yes, and I think I've got you and somewhat also John Clancy to thank for that, because it was you in particular who coaxed me, and I use that word advisedly, I suppose, to
it wasn't a
develop.
cattle. It wasn't a cattle prod, Sandy.
Well, it damn near was, yeah. Uh, to develop some of those parts more so than they were developed, and I think the book benefited greatly from that, and so I'm very thankful.
But you took to it so naturally, and you wrote those despite a natural, I think, very reasonable diffidence about whether you could do that effectively. I think you did, and you took to it with very good grace, but also effectiveness, I think.
Yeah, well, I would always envisage a much leaner set of passages because, in consonance with the lean, almost puritanical quality of the man, the Mujahid, he is a Puritan, as so many extremists are, and Nick was in his past anything but a
Yes.
Puritan. So again, there's a sort of a contrast there, I think, between. Yeah.
Very good, Sandy. Well, thank you for having a chat with me about what's been a very interesting and enjoyable voyage for me. And it's wonderful that now we can hold this object in our hands, and it's not just being endlessly edited and endlessly talked about, but it's actually a real thing.
Well, it looks damn good when you hold it up. Thanks to you and Hattie and the others involved. So I'm immensely grateful. It looks good, it feels good, and I'm so glad that you've talked to me, and I'm very grateful.